In the heart of New York City, a metropolis that never sleeps, one name resonated: power and affluence. Richard. Born in 1971 in Pretoria, South Africa, Richard had journeyed across continents to become one of the world's most influential entrepreneurs. As the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, his net worth had soared to astronomical heights, making him the richest man in America. Turn 0 Search 3. Despite his visionary ventures into electric vehicles and space exploration, Richard was often perceived as a ruthless businessman. His relentless pursuit of innovation left little room for empathy, and his interactions were frequently described as brusque, if not outright dismissive. One crisp autumn afternoon, Richard was en route to a high-profile meeting in Manhattan's upscale Upper East Side. His black Tesla Model S Plaid glided through the city's congested streets, a testament to his commitment to sustainable luxury. As the car approached the intersection of Fifth Avenue and 59th Street, near the entrance to Central Park, a small figure suddenly darted into the road. The driver slammed on the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a screeching halt mere inches from the pedestrian. A young girl no older than 7, stood frozen in front of the car, her wide eyes filled with terror. In her tiny hands she clutched a bouquet of wilted daisies, the petals bruised and edges browned by the city's harsh environment. Her clothes were tattered and her face smeared with dirt, a stark contrast to the gleaming vehicle before her. Richard's face contorted with anger as he stepped out of the car. The bustling street fell silent, onlookers pausing to witness the unfolding drama. Without a word, he raised his hand and struck the girl across the face. The force of the blow sent her sprawling onto the cold pavement, the daisies scattering around her like fallen soldiers. "How dare you?" Richard's voice thundered, echoing off the surrounding buildings. "Do you have any idea who I am? You could have damaged my car." The girl whimpered, tears mingling with the dirt on her cheeks. She scrambled to gather the scattered flowers, her small hands trembling. The crowd watched in stunned silence, whispers of disapproval rippling through the onlookers. A middle-aged man stepped forward from the crowd, his expression a mix of anger and compassion. "Sir, she's just a child trying to make a living. There's no need for violence." Richard turned his icy gaze toward the man. "Mind your own business," he spat. "People like her should know their place." The man shook his head, helping the girl to her feet. "Come on, sweetheart," he said gently. "Let's get you out of here." As they walked away, the girl glanced back at Richard, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and defiance. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving the billionaire standing alone beside his car, his face a mask of indifference. Later that evening, Richard sat in his opulent office on the top floor of the Tesla headquarters. The city skyline stretched out before him, a testament to his empire's reach. Yet, his mind kept drifting back to the incident with the flower girl. He dismissed the nagging thoughts, attributing them to the stress of his upcoming projects. Unbeknownst to him, the day's events had been captured on a bystander's smartphone. By nightfall, the video had gone viral on social media, sparking outrage across the nation. News outlets picked up the story, and hashtags condemning Richard's actions trended on Twitter and Facebook. In a modest neighborhood in Brooklyn, a woman named Maria Gonzalez watched the news with a heavy heart. Her frail hands clutched a photograph of a younger Richard, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, both smiling at the camera. Tears welled up in her eyes as she glanced at the small bedroom where her 7-year-old daughter, Isabella, slept peacefully. "Oh, Richard," she whispered to the empty room. "What have you become?" As the city buzzed with discussions about the incident, Richard remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He had faced controversies before and had always emerged unscathed. In his world, power and money could solve any problem. But this time, fate had a different plan. One that would challenge everything he believed in and force him to confront the consequences of his actions. Before going to the next chapter, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. New York City's skyline shimmered under the night sky, but for Richard Caldwell, one of the richest men in America, the world seemed eerily silent. Sitting in his penthouse office at Caldwell Enterprises, he swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His mind was restless, but he wasn't entirely sure why. That afternoon's incident at 5th Avenue and 59th Street had barely registered in his thoughts. To him, it was just another annoyance, an interruption in his fast-paced life. He had barely spared a thought for the little girl he had struck in anger. But outside his office, the world was erupting in outrage. Unknown to Richard, a bystander had recorded the entire incident and uploaded it to Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. The video spread like wildfire, accumulating millions of views within hours. Hashtags like hashtag justice for the flower girl and hashtag Caldwell slaps child began trending. Major news networks, CNN, Fox News, and the New York Times, picked up the story, replaying the video with scathing commentary. Billionaire Richard Caldwell attacks a helpless child on the streets of New York. Is this the real face of corporate America? Talk shows debated his actions. People dug into his past, questioning his morality, his treatment of employees, and his ruthless business tactics. The public had turned against him. The mystery of the flower girl. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, Maria Gonzalez sat in her tiny kitchen, scrolling through her phone with trembling fingers. The video of her daughter, Isabella, being slapped by Richard Caldwell was all over the internet. She could barely process what had happened. Her heart ached as she glanced at Isabella, who was curled up on their old couch, holding her bruised cheek. Maria had never wanted her daughter to sell flowers on the streets, but life had been cruel. Once she had been a maid in Caldwell Tower, cleaning offices she could never dream of working in. But a few years ago when she fell ill, she was fired without severance. The money dried up. Desperation led to Isabella selling flowers outside Central Park. And now, fate had brought her and Richard Caldwell together in the cruelest way imaginable. But the world didn't know the truth yet. The following morning, Richard Caldwell woke up to hundreds of missed calls from his PR team, lawyers, and business partners. The moment he turned on his phone, a flood of messages came through. David Stern, his head of public relations, burst into his office looking pale. "Richard, we have a situation." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What now?" David tossed his phone onto the desk. The video of him slapping the girl played on the screen. Richard frowned. "It's just a kid. It's not like I killed anyone." David exhaled sharply. "Do you even understand what's happening? Sponsors are pulling out. Stock prices are dropping. People are calling for a boycott of Caldwell Enterprises. If we don't act fast, this could destroy your reputation, permanently." For the first time, a flicker of worry crossed Richard's face. David continued, "We need to release a statement. Apologize, do some charity work, pay off the mother. Something." Richard scoffed. "I don't apologize to nobodies." David's jaw tightened. "Then you'll be the next billionaire to fall. Look at what happened to other CEOs who ignored public outrage." Richard leaned back in his chair, considering. He had never cared about what people thought of him. He believed power and money could solve any problem. But this time it felt different. As Richard prepared for damage control, Maria Gonzalez was making a difficult decision. The world was demanding to know the identity of the girl in the video, and journalists were already showing up outside her apartment. She knew she couldn't hide forever. She called an old contact at the New York Times, an investigative journalist named Ethan Reeves. Maria had once helped him with a story when she worked at Caldwell Tower, and she knew he could be trusted. When Ethan arrived, she handed him an old, yellowed envelope. "This is the truth," she whispered. "The truth about Richard Caldwell and Isabella." Ethan carefully pulled out the contents, a birth certificate. His eyes widened in shock as he read the name of Isabella's father. "Maria," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're telling me that Richard Caldwell?" "Yes," Maria interrupted. "Isabella is his daughter." Ethan's hands trembled. If this was true, the scandal would explode into something much bigger. Maria continued, tears in her eyes. "He doesn't know. He abandoned me before I could tell him. But now the whole world will know." Meanwhile, Richard was preparing for a press conference, planning to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding. But as he stood in front of the cameras, a breaking news alert flashed across the screen behind him. "Exclusive. The little girl in viral video is Richard Caldwell's secret daughter." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The reporters in the room erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved toward him. "Mr. Caldwell, is it true? Why did you abandon your daughter? Did you know she was selling flowers on the streets?" Richard's world spun. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of the revelation suffocating him. For the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell, the man who had always been in control, felt utterly powerless. And the worst part? He had no idea what to do next. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Richard Caldwell sat frozen in front of the cameras at the New York Stock Exchange, where he had planned to address the controversy. But this was not what he had expected. He was prepared to deny, dismiss, and move on. Instead, the entire world had just learned that the little girl he slapped on Fifth Avenue was his own daughter. Reporters shouted questions at him, their voices blending into a deafening storm. Mr. Caldwell, did you know about your daughter? Why was she selling flowers on the streets if you're a billionaire? Are you going to take responsibility now? Richard's grip tightened on the podium. His mind raced. This can't be true. But deep down something felt eerily familiar. The woman in the viral news story, Maria Gonzalez, was not just some random mother. He had known her. A past he wanted to forget. 20 years ago, Richard was just an ambitious businessman, climbing the corporate ladder in Manhattan. Maria was a housekeeper at his first luxury apartment in Upper East Side, a young woman with a warm smile and deep brown eyes. Back then, Richard had not yet turned into the ruthless billionaire he was today. He had been reckless, arrogant, and careless. Maria was different, kind, patient, and always looking out for others. They had a brief relationship, one he never took seriously. He was a man chasing power, and she was just a momentary distraction. One day, she told him she was pregnant. Richard had laughed it off, thinking she was lying to trap him. "Maria, I don't have time for this," he had said, leaving her apartment for the last time. He never looked back. Now that decision had come back to haunt him. Damage control or redemption? Richard's PR team scrambled to contain the disaster. His lawyer, Henry Blackwood, grabbed his arm and whispered, "We need to leave. Now." Richard snapped out of his daze and nodded. Without answering the reporters, he turned and walked off the stage. As soon as he entered his private limousine, David Stern, his PR manager, pulled up the news on his iPad. CNN headline, "Billionaire Richard Caldwell's secret daughter. A slap that exposed the truth." Fox News headline, "Is Richard Caldwell the worst father in America?" Twitter was on fire. Thousands of posts flooded the internet. Some called him a monster. Others demanded he take responsibility. Celebrities joined the backlash, shaming him for abandoning his daughter. David clenched his jaw. "We need to respond. We can still control the narrative." Richard exhaled sharply. "How? I just found out I have a daughter through a damn news article." David didn't back down. "Then find out the truth, fast. Because if you don't, the world will decide it for you." That evening, Richard's limousine pulled up outside a small apartment building in Brooklyn. It was a stark contrast to his world of penthouses and private jets. The air smelled of street food, and children played outside on cracked sidewalks. Maria's apartment was on the third floor. Richard hesitated before knocking. His fists tightened. How did my life get here? The door opened, and there she was, Maria Gonzalez, standing before him for the first time in 2 decades. She didn't look surprised. She looked exhausted. "You finally came," she said, crossing her arms. Richard exhaled. "Is it true?" Maria stepped aside, letting him enter. The apartment was small, cluttered but warm. The smell of home-cooked food filled the air. In the living room, a little girl with dark hair sat on the couch, hugging a stuffed bear. Isabella. Richard felt his chest tighten. This was the girl he had struck in the street. His daughter. Maria motioned for Isabella to go to her room. As soon as she left, Richard turned to Maria. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was sharp, almost accusatory. Maria let out a bitter laugh. "Tell you? You left before I even had the chance. You called me a liar." Richard swallowed hard. He had no defense. Maria stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "I raised her alone, Richard. I lost my job at Caldwell Tower because of company layoffs. We've struggled for years while you sat in your towers making billions." Richard didn't know what to say. He had never been at a loss for words before, but now he was drowning in regret. Maria shook her head. "You think an apology is enough? That you can just walk in and fix everything?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "But I want to try." Maria scoffed. "The world is watching you, Richard. If you really care about Isabella, prove it, not to me but to her." The father's first step. Richard left the apartment feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him. He had spent his whole life chasing power, but in that moment he realized he had nothing. His daughter didn't even know him. Back in his penthouse, he stared at the city skyline, lost in thought. His phone buzzed. A message from David. "The board is considering removing you as CEO. We need a response ASAP." For the first time, Richard didn't care about Caldwell Enterprises. He cared about something he had never cared for before. His family. The next morning, the headlines changed again. Breaking news. Richard Caldwell announces multi-million-dollar trust fund for his daughter. Caldwell pledges to personally apologize to Isabella in front of the nation. The media was still skeptical, but for the first time people wondered, was Richard Caldwell changing? Maria, watching from home, wasn't impressed. Money wasn't the answer. But Isabella, peeking over her mother's shoulder, saw something else in Richard's face on TV. For the first time she saw a man who looked lost. A man who, maybe, just maybe, wanted to find his way. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The morning air in New York City was crisp as Richard Caldwell sat in the back of his black Rolls-Royce, staring at his own reflection in the tinted window. He had spent decades building an empire, yet last night for the first time he felt like everything was slipping away. His lawyers had already started damage control. His PR team had advised him to make a public apology. But deep down, Richard knew that no press conference could fix what he had done. He had to face Isabella. Richard wasn't the kind of man to second-guess himself, but as the car approached Brooklyn, doubt gnawed at him. How could he, a billionaire who had spent his life prioritizing business over people, suddenly become a father? His driver pulled up outside Maria's apartment building. The street was alive with activity, street vendors selling breakfast sandwiches, children running to school, and neighbors exchanging morning gossip. This was a world Richard had never been Richard's to. As he stepped out, a few passers-by recognized him. Some whispered, others openly stared. The billionaire who slapped a child was now in Brooklyn. Maria opened the door before he even knocked. "What now?" she asked, arms crossed. "I want to see her," Richard said. Maria hesitated but then stepped aside. "You have 5 minutes." Isabella was sitting at the small wooden table, coloring in a notebook. She looked up as Richard entered, her brown eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and caution. Richard had closed million-dollar deals, faced aggressive investors, and even gone to court against some of the toughest lawyers in Wall Street. But now, standing before a 7-year-old, he had no idea what to say. He cleared his throat. "Isabella, do you know who I am?" The little girl nodded. "You're the man from TV." Richard flinched. I'm your father." She stared at him for a long moment, then tilted her head. "You're the man who hit me." Silence. Maria tensed, but Richard held up his hand. "You're right," he said, his voice heavy. "And I was wrong. I'm sorry." Isabella didn't say anything. She just picked up a red crayon and went back to coloring. Richard sat down across from her. "What are you drawing?" "A castle," she said without looking up. He glanced at the page. She had drawn a castle with tall towers surrounded by trees. It was simple, but he could tell she had spent time on it. "You like castles?" Richard asked. She nodded. "They're safe. Nobody can hurt you in a castle." Richard felt a lump in his throat. She had drawn a place where she felt safe, from him. After a moment, Isabella put her crayon down and looked at him. "Are you really my dad?" Richard nodded. "Then why didn't you come before?" she asked. Maria shifted uncomfortably, but Richard forced himself to answer. "Because I didn't know about you." Isabella thought about this for a moment. Then she asked, "Are you going to leave again?" Richard wasn't sure how to respond. He wanted to say no, but could he promise that? Could he suddenly change overnight? Instead he said, "Do you want me to stay?" Isabella hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Maria's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent. Richard exhaled. "Then I'll stay." For the first time since arriving, he saw a tiny smile on Isabella's face. Over the next few days, Richard did something he had never done before. He made time for someone other than himself. He picked Isabella up from PS 321, her elementary school in Brooklyn. He took her to a bookstore and let her pick out any book she wanted. He even took her to Central Park, where they sat on a bench and watched street performers. The media followed him everywhere, snapping photos, analyzing every move. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others saw it as a genuine attempt at redemption. Maria remained skeptical. "You can buy her books, take her to parks, even apologize in front of the world," she told him one evening. "But if you don't show up when it matters, none of this means anything." Richard knew she was right. One evening, Richard received a call from his assistant. "Sir, the Caldwell Enterprises board wants a meeting. They're considering a temporary CEO until the scandal dies down." Richard had built that company from the ground up. Losing control was not an option. But as he ended the call, he heard Isabella coughing from the other room. It was deep and rough, making Maria rush to her side. "She's had a bad cough all day," Maria said, worry on her face. Richard didn't hesitate. "We're taking her to the hospital." At Mount Sinai Hospital, doctors ran tests. Isabella was exhausted, leaning against Maria, her tiny body drained of energy. Richard sat beside them, feeling utterly helpless. Money couldn't fix this. All he could do was wait. Finally, the doctor came back. "She has a respiratory infection. It's treatable, but she needs rest and care." Richard let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Maria sighed in relief. Thank God. As they prepared to leave, Richard's phone buzzed again. Another call from Caldwell Enterprises. For the first time in his life he ignored it. That night, Richard stayed with Isabella until she fell asleep. Maria watched from the doorway, arms crossed. I didn't think you'd stay, she admitted. Richard looked at her. Neither did I. She nodded slowly. Maybe you really are trying. He was. As he left, he glanced back at Isabella, curled up in bed. For the first time he didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a father. And that meant more than any company ever could. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The next morning, Richard Caldwell sat by Isabella's hospital bed at Mount Sinai Hospital, watching her sleep. The machines beeped softly, and the white sheets made her look even smaller than she was. A week ago he didn't even know she existed. Now he couldn't imagine life without her. Maria walked into the room holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word and sat down. She's going to be okay, she murmured. Richard nodded. I know. They sat in silence for a while before Maria finally spoke. You missed a call from your company, she said, glancing at his phone on the table. Richard didn't even look at it. I don't care. Maria raised an eyebrow. You don't care about the company you built? I care about my daughter more. Maria studied him for a moment as if trying to figure out if he was serious. Finally she sighed. You're not the same man you were a week ago, she admitted. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. A week ago, I was a selfish, arrogant billionaire who thought money could solve everything. Maria smirked. That's still mostly true. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. Fair. Then he looked at Isabella. But she's changing me. Maria softened. Good. Because she deserves better. Later that afternoon the doctor came in with a clipboard. She's improving, he said. But I recommend she rest at home for at least a week before going back to school. Richard nodded. I'll make sure she gets everything she needs. Maria looked at him sharply. We'll make sure. He caught the correction. Right. As they were checking out, Richard's driver pulled up outside the hospital in his black Rolls-Royce. Maria frowned. She's not used to this life, she said. Richard hesitated. Then what is she used to? Walking home from school. Taking the subway. Playing in the park. Richard realized how different their lives had been. He had spent his life in penthouse suites, private jets, and boardrooms. Isabella had spent hers in a small Brooklyn apartment with second-hand toys and home-cooked meals. I want to be part of her life, he said seriously. Maria nodded. Then don't try to change hers overnight. An attempt at normalcy. That evening Richard did something he hadn't done in decades. He cooked. Well, he tried. Maria sat at the kitchen table, smirking as he struggled to flip a pancake in a Brooklyn apartment that was too small for a billionaire but perfect for a child. Isabella giggled as he burned the first one. You're really bad at this, she said. Richard laughed. I haven't cooked in a long time. Maria shook her head. And it shows. Despite the failed pancakes, the night was filled with laughter. For the first time, Richard felt like a real father. After dinner, Isabella grabbed his hand. Can we go to the park? Richard hesitated. He wasn't used to casual outings. Everything in his life had been planned, scheduled, and managed. But when he saw the excitement in her eyes, he nodded. Let's go. As they walked to Prospect Park, Richard noticed how people stared. Some recognized him from TV, the billionaire who slapped a little girl. Others just saw a man in an expensive suit walking through Brooklyn with a child. Isabella didn't care. She ran ahead, laughing as she chased pigeons. Richard sat on a bench, watching her. This is what she does every day? He asked Maria. Maria nodded. This is her world. For the first time, Richard realized he wasn't introducing Isabella to his life. She was introducing him to hers. As Isabella played, Richard's phone buzzed. It was his assistant. Sir, the board is voting tomorrow, she said urgently. They think you're distracted. If you don't show up, they might replace you. Richard's jaw tightened. He had spent 30 years building Caldwell Enterprises. Could he really lose it in a week? Maria must have seen the look on his face. Work? She guessed. Richard sighed. Yeah. If I don't go back tomorrow, I might lose my company. Maria folded her arms. And what happens if you do go back? He hesitated. She nodded. That's what I thought. Richard looked at Isabella, running in circles, completely unaware of the billion-dollar decision he had to make. For the first time he had no idea what to do. That night, as Richard tucked Isabella into bed, she looked up at him. Are you leaving? She asked. Richard's heart clenched as he sat on the edge of the bed. Do you want me to? She shook her head. He took a deep breath. Then I'm staying. Maria, standing in the doorway, looked surprised. Richard Caldwell, the billionaire who had always chosen business over people, was choosing his daughter instead. And for the first time in his life, it felt like the right decision. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Richard Caldwell woke up to the sound of laughter. It was still a foreign sound in his life, so light, so full of warmth. For decades, his mornings had started with stock reports, urgent emails, and the quiet hum of his penthouse. But today, it was Isabella's giggles coming from the kitchen. He rolled over on the couch, rubbing his eyes. The old cushions in Maria's Brooklyn apartment weren't as comfortable as his king-sized bed at the Plaza Hotel, but last night, for the first time in years, he had slept without tossing and turning. When he walked into the kitchen, he found Isabella at the table, her hands sticky with syrup as Maria flipped pancakes. You're awake, Maria said, raising an eyebrow. I was wondering if billionaires slept past noon. Richard smirked. Only when they spend the night on a couch that's older than the stock market. Maria rolled her eyes, handing Isabella a plate. You could have gone home, you know. Richard glanced at Isabella, who was grinning at him. No, I couldn't. He took a seat beside her, stealing a piece of her pancake. You stayed? Isabella asked, her voice filled with surprise and hope. Richard nodded. I did. Her smile could have lit up all of Times Square. Just as they were finishing breakfast, Richard's phone buzzed. He knew it was coming. He had been ignoring his company for too long. Maria watched as he hesitated before answering. Richard, came the familiar voice of David Sinclair, his right-hand man at Caldwell Enterprises. The board is waiting. Richard sighed. David, I told you. They're voting to remove you today. If you're not here, it's over. Maria leaned against the counter, arms crossed. She had heard every word. Isabella, too busy making a syrup castle on her plate, was blissfully unaware that her father was about to lose everything he had built. I'll call you back, Richard said, hanging up. Maria raised an eyebrow. Are you really going to let them do this? Richard exhaled. I don't know. For decades, Caldwell Enterprises had been his life. He had built it from nothing, turning it into one of New York's most powerful real estate empires. It had made him a billionaire. It had given him power, respect. But it had also taken everything from him. His marriage, his happiness, and now it was threatening to take time away from the one person who mattered most. I used to think money was everything, Richard admitted. Maria scoffed. No kidding. He chuckled. I thought if I had enough, I'd never need anything else. But now, he looked at Isabella. Maria softened. Now you have something money can't buy. Richard nodded. Maria sighed. Listen, I'm not going to tell you what to do. But if you walk away from your company today, you need to be sure it's what you want. Richard rubbed his temples. And if I fight for it? She gave him a sad smile. Then make sure you don't lose her in the process. Instead of heading straight to the office, Richard decided to take a walk with Isabella. They strolled down Fifth Avenue in Brooklyn, where small businesses lined the street. It was a far cry from the towering glass buildings Richard was used to. They stopped outside a toy store and Isabella's eyes lit up. Can we go in? She asked. Richard hesitated. He had never taken a child shopping before. He had never done any of the things fathers were supposed to do. Of course, he said. Inside, Isabella ran straight to the dolls, her fingers tracing the different outfits. Richard watched her, realizing how simple her happiness was. He pulled out his black Amex card. You can have whatever you want. But Isabella shook her head. I don't need everything. Richard blinked. She picked out a single Barbie doll. Just this one. Richard couldn't help but smile. His daughter had more wisdom in her 8-year-old heart than he had in his entire billion-dollar empire. Facing the boardroom. An hour later, Richard stood in the lobby of Caldwell Enterprises, staring at the giant glass doors that led to the boardroom. Inside, men in custom Armani suits were waiting to vote him out of his own company. He had built this empire, but for the first time in his life he wasn't sure he wanted it anymore. Maria's words echoed in his head, make sure you don't lose her in the process. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the doors. David Sinclair stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. The other board members murmured amongst themselves. Richard, David said. You're late. Richard smirked. Had more important things to do. The men exchanged glances. David cleared his throat. We're voting on your removal today. The company is at risk. You've been absent. Investors are worried. Richard leaned back in his chair, glancing at the familiar faces around him. These were men who worshipped power and profit. He had been one of them. But now he saw things differently. What if I stepped down voluntarily? Richard said. The room went silent. David frowned. Are you serious? Richard nodded. I am. The board members looked at one another, shocked. You built this empire, one of them said. I did, Richard agreed. But it cost me too much. David studied him for a moment. What will you do now? Richard smiled. Be a father. And just like that, Richard Caldwell walked away from the empire he had built, choosing love over legacy, family over fortune. That evening, Richard returned to Maria's apartment with takeout from Junior's cheesecake. Isabella gasped. Cheesecake? Richard laughed. I figured we should celebrate. Maria raised an eyebrow. Celebrate what? Richard sat down, exhaling. I walked away from Caldwell Enterprises. Maria's eyes widened. You actually did it? He nodded. I did. Isabella grinned, hugging him. Does this mean you're staying forever? Richard hugged her back. Yeah, kid. I'm staying forever. For the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell wasn't the billionaire, the businessman, or the ruthless CEO. He was simply a father, and it was the greatest role he had ever played. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Richard Caldwell sat on a bench in Brooklyn Bridge Park, watching the sun dip below the skyline. The golden light reflected off the East River, casting long shadows over the city he once ruled. He wasn't a billionaire CEO anymore. He wasn't the man whose name sent shivers through Wall Street. Now he was just a father trying to make up for lost time. Isabella sat beside him, licking an ice cream cone, her legs swinging back and forth. You really don't have to go back? She asked, her voice small. Richard shook his head. No, sweetheart. I don't. A part of him still couldn't believe it. He had walked into that boardroom ready to fight, but instead he had handed over the keys to the empire he had built. No golden parachute, no farewell press conference, just a quiet goodbye. He had chosen family over fortune. But what if fortune wasn't done with him yet? The next morning, Richard's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, until he saw the location, Washington, D.C. Frowning, he answered. Richard Caldwell? A sharp voice asked. Yes. Who's this? This is Elliot Grayson from the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. I need to speak with you regarding Caldwell Enterprises. Richard stiffened. I'm no longer involved with the company. I know. That's the problem. Richard's stomach tightened. He had expected backlash from stepping down, but not from the federal government. Meet me at the St. Regis Hotel in Manhattan, Elliot said. We need to talk now. An hour later, Richard walked into the grand lobby of the St. Regis, where the chandeliers sparkled like stars and suited men murmured over cocktails. At a quiet table in the corner sat Elliot Grayson, a no-nonsense man in his 50s, with silver hair and the hard eyes of a man who had seen too many corporate scandals. Richard sat down. What's this about? Elliot slid a folder across the table. Richard opened it, and felt his stomach drop. Inside were financial reports, offshore accounts, and forged documents with his name on them. I didn't do this, Richard said immediately. Elliot studied him. I believe you. But someone inside Caldwell Enterprises did. Richard exhaled sharply. David Sinclair. Elliot nodded. After you left, Sinclair took over as interim CEO. That's when things got messy. The SEC has been tracking offshore accounts linked to the company. Money laundering, fraud, you name it. And your name is all over these papers. Richard clenched his jaw. He's setting me up. Maybe. Maybe he's just trying to cover his tracks. Elliot leaned in. Either way, you need to clear your name before this explodes. Richard left the hotel with his mind racing. He had walked away from Caldwell Enterprises to protect Isabella, to be the father she deserved. But now his past was coming back to haunt him. Maria was waiting for him at the apartment. She took one look at his face and frowned. What happened? He handed her the folder. She flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing. That son of a... She stopped herself, glancing at Isabella, who was playing with her new Barbie on the couch. Richard sighed. I have to fix this. Maria crossed her arms. And how do you plan to do that? Richard hesitated. I need to go back. Maria's expression hardened. Go back? To the same company you walked away from? If I don't, I could go to prison, Richard said quietly. Maria's face softened. You didn't do this. Richard ran a hand through his hair. That doesn't matter. What matters is proving it. Maria exhaled. So what's the plan? Richard looked at Isabella, his heart heavy. I'm going to take back my company. The next morning, Richard walked into the headquarters of Caldwell Enterprises. Security hesitated before letting him through, but no one stopped him as he strode into the boardroom. David Sinclair was at the head of the table, looking perfectly at home in Richard's old chair. The board members turned in surprise as Richard walked in like he had never left. Richard, David said smoothly, though his eyes darkened. I wasn't expecting you. Richard smirked. That's your first mistake. David laughed. You don't work here anymore. Richard tossed the SEC folder onto the table. Neither will you once they see this. David's face paled as he flipped through the documents. Offshore accounts. Money laundering. Fraud. Richard leaned in. You thought I wouldn't find out? David straightened. These documents have your name on them too. Richard smiled. Yeah. But the SEC already knows I didn't sign them. David's hands clenched. You have no proof. Richard slid his phone across the table. On the screen was a recording, a voice memo from a private investigator Richard had hired. David's voice played loud and clear. Richard doesn't know a thing. As long as we keep moving the money, the SEC won't touch us. The boardroom fell silent. David's face turned ashen. Richard leaned back. Now you have two choices. Either you step down quietly, or I make sure you go to prison. David swallowed hard. He knew the game was over. Without another word he stood, nodded once and walked out. Richard exhaled that he had won, but at what cost? Later that night, Richard returned to Maria's apartment. Isabella ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. You're back. Richard held her tightly. Yeah, kid. I'm back. Maria watched him, her eyes questioning. So what now? Richard smiled. Now I resign, for real this time. Maria blinked. You fought to take back the company just to leave it again? Richard nodded. I had to fix my mistakes. But my place isn't in boardrooms. He looked at Isabella. It's here. Maria smirked. So what's next for Richard Caldwell? He shrugged. Maybe I'll start something new. Something that actually helps people. Maria raised an eyebrow. Like what? Richard grinned. I don't know. Maybe a business that actually makes the world better. Maria chuckled. That's a first. Richard laughed, pulling Isabella onto his lap. Whatever it is, it starts here. With family. For the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell wasn't chasing wealth or power, that he was finally chasing happiness. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Richard Caldwell had finally reclaimed his freedom. After exposing David Sinclair and clearing his name, he had officially resigned from Caldwell Enterprises. No more boardrooms. No more cutthroat business deals. No more lonely nights staring at financial reports instead of spending time with his daughter. For the first time in years, Richard could breathe, but the past wasn't done with him yet. It had been a quiet morning in Brooklyn Heights, where Richard and Isabella had been staying with Maria. The small apartment had become a home, a place where Richard was learning to cook breakfast, help with homework, and be a real father. Isabella was sitting on the couch, playing with her tablet, when a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Maria, sipping her coffee, frowned. You expecting someone? Richard shook his head. No. He walked to the door, hesitated for a moment, and then pulled it open. Standing on the other side was a man Richard hadn't seen in over a decade. Mark Bennett. Richard's heart clenched. Mark had been his closest friend when they were young, back when they were just two kids trying to make it in New York City. They had built Caldwell Enterprises together, until greed, ambition, and betrayal had torn them apart. What the hell are you doing here? Richard asked. Mark smirked. Nice to see you too, Richie. Richard didn't invite him in, but Mark stepped inside anyway, his sharp blue eyes scanning the apartment. He wore an expensive suit, Tom Ford if Richard had to guess, and a Rolex that likely cost more than the rent on this place. Looks like you've downgraded, Mark said, smirking. Richard folded his arms. Get to the point. Mark sighed. All right, fine. I heard about what happened with Sinclair. Impressive work, by the way. Richard said nothing. Mark leaned in. I have an offer for you. Richard scoffed. Not interested. You don't even know what it is. I don't need to, Richard shot back. I'm done with the corporate world. Mark chuckled. Oh, come on. We both know that's a lie. Richard clenched his jaw. Mark slid a business card onto the table. There's a new venture. Big money. Bigger than Caldwell Enterprises ever was. Richard glanced at the card. The company name was unfamiliar, Stratford Holdings, but he recognized the address. Wall Street. He shook his head. I'm out of that life. Mark smirked. Sure. That's why the SEC almost dragged you into a scandal a few weeks ago. Richard tensed. Mark took a step closer. Listen, Richie. You can pretend all you want, but the truth is, you were born for this. You think you can just play house and forget who you are? Richard's hands curled into fists. Get out. Mark laughed. All right. But think about it. The door is always open. He tapped the business card once and then strolled out. Richard slammed the door shut. Maria looked up from the kitchen. Who was that? Richard exhaled. No one important. But that was a lie. Mark Bennett wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was a warning. That night, Richard lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Mark was right about one thing. He couldn't just erase who he had been. He had spent 20 years chasing power, wealth, and control. Even now, there was a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind, whispering that he missed it, missed the deals, missed the adrenaline, missed the game. But then he thought about Isabella, thought about how she looked up at him with trust in her eyes, thought about how she called him Dad without hesitation now. He had fought too hard to become the father she deserved that he wasn't going to lose himself again. The next morning, Richard took Isabella to Prospect Park. It was one of her favorite places, filled with open fields, playgrounds, and a small lake where she loved to watch the ducks. She was running ahead, laughing when Richard's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He almost ignored it, until he saw the message. You made the wrong choice, Richie. Watch your back. Richard's blood ran cold that he scanned the park, his eyes sharp. Was Mark serious? Was this just another mind game? Or was something worse coming? Richard didn't know. But one thing was certain. His past wasn't done with him yet. And this time, it wasn't just his reputation on the line. It was his life. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Richard Caldwell had spent years maneuvering through the high-stakes corporate world, dodging lawsuits, scandals, and betrayals. But nothing had prepared him for this, a faceless threat looming over him and his daughter. As he stood in Prospect Park, staring at the ominous text on his phone, his instincts kicked in. He scanned the crowd. Parents with children, joggers, elderly couples enjoying the sun. No one looked out of place. But Richard knew better. Some threats weren't meant to be seen until it was too late. He needed information. Richard scrolled through his contacts and found the name Detective James O'Connor, a veteran cop with the NYPD's Financial Crimes Unit. They weren't exactly friends, but James had once tried to nail Richard for insider trading. Even though Richard had walked away clean, he respected the detective's persistence. Richard hit call. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. O'Connor. It's Richard Caldwell. Pause. Then a sarcastic chuckle. Well. If it isn't Wall Street's favorite fallen angel. To what do I owe the pleasure? I need a favor. That's funny because last I checked, you were the guy who never needed help. Richard clenched his jaw. This is serious. O'Connor sighed. All right. Talk. Richard hesitated. How much should he say? He didn't want Isabella involved in any of this, but he also couldn't ignore the warning he had received. I got a message, Richard finally said. Threatening. From someone I used to work with. O'Connor didn't sound impressed. You made a lot of enemies, Caldwell. Be more specific. Mark Bennett. That got the detective's attention. The same Mark Bennett who disappeared after that securities fraud case 5 years ago? O'Connor asked. Richard frowned. He disappeared? Yeah. Feds were on his tail for running a Ponzi scheme under a fake investment firm. But before they could charge him, he vanished. No one's seen him since. That sent a chill down Richard's spine. If Mark had resurfaced now, it wasn't by coincidence. Tell me what you know, Richard demanded. O'Connor sighed. Look, Caldwell. I don't like you, but I hate guys like Bennett even more. I'll see what I can dig up. Make it quick, Richard said before hanging up. Richard tucked his phone away and turned back toward Isabella. She was still near the lake, tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks. But as he approached, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. A man was standing too close to her. Tall, dark sunglasses, wearing a leather jacket despite the warm weather. Richard's heart pounded. He picked up his pace. Isabella, he called out, forcing his voice to stay calm. She turned and smiled. Dad. This man was just telling me about. Richard grabbed her hand and pulled her behind him, his eyes locked on the stranger. The man didn't flinch. He simply smirked. Relax, Mr. Caldwell. Just having a friendly chat. Richard's blood boiled. Who the hell are you? The man pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. Richard didn't take it. Instead, he read the name printed in bold letters. Mark's company. Richard's fists clenched. Tell your boss I'm not interested. Lucas chuckled. Oh, I think you'll want to hear what he has to say. But if you don't, well, he glanced at Isabella. That's a real shame. Richard's vision went red. He stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. If you ever go near my daughter again, I'll make sure you regret it. Lucas raised his hands in mock surrender. No need to be hostile. Just passing along a message. And then just like that he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Richard could still feel his pulse hammering as he knelt in front of Isabella. You okay, sweetheart? He asked. She nodded, confused. Was that man bad? Richard forced a smile. Just someone I used to know. He picked her up and carried her toward the exit. He had to get her home. Safe. Away from all of this. As they reached the car, his phone buzzed again. Another text. You can't run from who you are, Richie. Time to choose a side. Richard exhaled slowly. No. He wasn't going to play Mark's game. But if Mark wanted a fight, he was damn sure going to get one. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Richard Caldwell had spent his life making tough decisions, but nothing compared to the one he was about to face. Sitting in his Fifth Avenue penthouse, he stared at the cryptic text from Mark Bennett. You can't run from who you are, Richie. Time to choose a side. Mark wanted something from him, something dangerous. And if Richard didn't cooperate, Isabella's life might be in danger. He had to act fast. Richard dialed Detective James O'Connor. The phone rang twice before O'Connor picked up. Caldwell. Tell me you've got something useful. I just had a run-in with one of Mark's guys, Richard said. A man named Lucas Grant. Works for Stratford Holdings. O'Connor cursed under his breath. Damn. That means Bennett's officially back in play. What does he want? O'Connor sighed. Last I checked, Stratford Holdings wasn't just an investment firm. It was a front for laundering dirty money, cartel cash, stolen assets, offshore accounts. If Bennett is reaching out to you, he either needs you in on the game or you're a loose end. Richard clenched his jaw. I'm not playing his game. You might not have a choice, O'Connor said. Guys like Bennett don't take no for an answer. Richard ran a hand through his hair. He had dealt with sharks before, but Mark was a different breed. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a criminal. And now he had his sights set on Richard. Later that evening, Richard received another text. Meet me at the Polo Bar. 10 p.m. Come alone. The Polo Bar was one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Politicians, CEOs, and celebrities dined there under dim golden lights, making million-dollar deals over dry-aged steaks. Mark had chosen this place for a reason. It was public, safe. But Richard knew better. Nothing was ever safe when Mark was involved. Still, he had no choice. At exactly 10 p.m., Richard walked into the Polo Bar. The place was packed with the city's elite. Servers in crisp uniforms moved between tables, pouring expensive wine and serving plates of New York strip steak. Richard spotted Mark immediately. Dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit, he sat in the farthest booth, sipping a glass of Macallan whiskey. He looked exactly the same, sharp blue eyes, slicked back blonde hair, and that same arrogant smirk. Richie, Mark greeted, leaning back. Been too long. Richard slid into the booth, keeping his expression neutral. Cut the crap, Mark. What do you want? Mark chuckled. Straight to business. I always liked that about you. Richard didn't respond. He was done playing games. Mark sighed. All right, here's the deal. I need a man on the inside, someone who can move a little money for me, keep the feds off my back. Richard's eyes narrowed. You want me to launder money? Launder is such an ugly word, Mark said, swirling his whiskey. Let's just say, redirect funds to more favorable locations. Richard leaned forward. And if I say no? Mark smirked. Then we both lose, Richie. He pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. Richard's blood ran cold. On the screen was a photo of Isabella, taken that afternoon at Prospect Park. She was feeding the ducks, completely unaware that someone had been watching. Richard's hands clenched into fists. You son of a... Mark held up a hand. Relax. She's safe, for now. But if you don't play along, well, accidents happen. Richard forced himself to breathe. Losing control wouldn't help Isabella. He had to think. I need time, Richard said. Mark smiled. Of course. Take 48 hours. But don't try anything stupid, Richie. I'd hate for you to regret it. With that, Mark stood, straightened his suit, and walked out, Richard sat there, gripping the edge of the table. He had 48 hours. The moment Richard left the polo bar, he called O'Connor. "I need you to put a tail on Mark Bennett," Richard said. "Find out where he's staying, who he's working with." O'Connor exhaled sharply. "Damn it, Caldwell. You should have called me before meeting him." "I didn't have a choice," Richard snapped. "He threatened my daughter." O'Connor went silent. Then he said, "All right. We'll put eyes on him. But you better not agree to anything." Richard rubbed his temple. "I won't. But I need a plan fast." O'Connor sighed. "I'll see what I can do." Richard hung up and hailed a cab back to his penthouse. His mind was racing. He had spent years escaping the criminal world of Wall Street, but now it was pulling him back in. The difference was, this time he wasn't fighting for money, he was fighting for his daughter's life. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Richard Caldwell had spent the last 48 hours planning his next move, knowing that failure meant losing his daughter forever. Mark Bennett had made one mistake. He thought Richard was still the same desperate man he once controlled. But Richard wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Isabella. Richard met Detective James O'Connor in a dimly lit parking garage in Brooklyn. O'Connor had spent the past 2 days tracking Mark's movements and gathering evidence. "We've got him," O'Connor said, handing Richard a file. "Bank records, offshore accounts, even some dirty dealings with a cartel in Miami. We just need him in the act." Richard nodded. "That's where I come in." His plan was dangerous, but it was the only way. Richard met Mark in a rooftop lounge in Manhattan, pretending to accept his deal. Mark, confident in his power, ordered a round of drinks and slid a USB drive across the table. "Transfer the money and we're golden," Mark said. Richard took the USB, but before he could react, Mark smirked and gestured toward the entrance. Lucas Grant stood there, holding Isabella. Richard's heart stopped. "You thought I wouldn't plan for betrayal?" Mark laughed. "If you try anything, she dies." But Richard had planned for this. O'Connor and his team burst in, guns drawn. FBI. Hands in the air. Chaos erupted. Mark tried to run, but Richard tackled him. Lucas pulled a gun, but a sniper shot rang out from a nearby rooftop, taking him down. In the confusion, Richard grabbed Isabella and shielded her. Mark, bloodied and furious, was dragged away in cuffs. "This isn't over, Caldwell," he shouted, but Richard knew it was. Days later, Richard sat with Isabella in Central Park, watching her play. "Daddy, are the bad guys gone?" she asked. Richard smiled, pulling her close. "Yes, sweetheart. They're gone." For the first time in years he felt free. The past was behind him. The future be Richard's. To Isabella. "Before you go, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends.